There's nothing more shocking than justice delayed, but even more astonishing is when that justice is served for someone long gone. Imagine a serial rapist who terrorized communities and vanished without a trace for decades, suddenly being identified as the culprit. The twist? The man had been dead for more than 25 years. This isn't a Hollywood crime thriller. It's the real story that unfolded on September 4th, 2025. Ventura County, California. Once a peaceful coastal town in the mid-80s, it became the stage for a mysterious predator. Police discovered a DNA sample, a crude yet promising piece of evidence. Little did they know, it belonged to Sean Patrick McNulty, a former U.S. Navy diver whose unassuming appearance masked a dark secret. McNulty was not a notorious criminal figure. He served in the Navy from 1979 to 1992, holding steady jobs and leading what appeared to be a normal life. He married in 1988, but divorced shortly before his death. Beneath that ordinary exterior, however, lay a twisted nature. In 1978, he had been arrested for telephone harassment, a warning sign of his deviant behavior. After that, the record went silent. McNulty's crimes shared a disturbing pattern. He would break into the homes of young women at night, restrain them in some cases, and commit sexual assault. The terror he inflicted was not limited to Ventura, California, but spread to Ohio and Michigan. In total, he was responsible for 6 known rapes, including 2 in Ventura in 1982 and 1983. One survivor in Columbus, Ohio, recalled the terrifying night of December 1997 when an intruder broke into her home, tied her up, and assaulted her. At the time, McNulty was placed on the suspect list, but before police could make an arrest, he had taken his own life. With McNulty gone, all evidence seemed meaningless. The cases faded into obscurity, becoming cold cases no one expected to solve. Life went on, yet the shadow of fear lingered for the survivors. That is, until modern technology changed everything. Years later, a groundbreaking initiative was launched, the Ventura County Sexual Assault Kit Initiative, aimed at re-examining hundreds of untested DNA kits from old cases. Among them was the sample collected from one of the 2 Ventura rapes in 1982. The DNA was analyzed and uploaded into a public genealogical database, reigniting hope that had long been extinguished. Even though McNulty had passed away, his genetic footprint remained alive. The crimes in the early investigation. Before Sean Patrick McNulty's name surfaced through modern DNA technology, the world only knew fragments, cases that seemed unrelated, victims whose voices went unheard, and a shadow that haunted multiple states. McNulty's crimes followed a chilling pattern. Under the cover of night, he would quietly break into homes, often of young women living alone. Sometimes he entered through unlocked windows, other times through doors forced open with calculated precision. Once inside, he would restrain his victims, ensuring he could act without interruption and leave them terrorized and helpless. The attacks were not random. Locations were carefully chosen: Ventura, Columbus, and parts of Michigan, each city a link in a dark, invisible network only McNulty understood. His military training gave him a methodical edge. Precision, patience, and calm under pressure allowed him to evade capture for years, while leaving behind a trail of fear and unanswered questions. Local police at the time were baffled. Reports trickled in sporadically: a woman tied and assaulted, a neighbor noticing a suspicious figure, a door ajar with signs of forced entry. Yet with no solid suspects, no fingerprints, and limited forensic technology, the cases were classified as, quote, unsolved. Investigators combed through evidence painstakingly, dusting for prints, interviewing witnesses, and mapping patterns, but McNulty remained a ghost. Each unresolved case weighed heavily on the officers. Detectives pored over files late into the night, trying to connect dots that seemed to have no pattern. It was frustrating, infuriating, and, for the survivors, painfully slow justice. At the time, the idea that one man could span multiple states and leave so few traces seemed almost unbelievable. The breakthrough would not come until decades later, when DNA evidence, once collected and stored in dusty evidence rooms, became the key to unlocking the past. What had been a puzzle too complex for the forensic tools of the 80s and 90s would eventually be solved, not through luck, but through the evolution of science and the persistence of investigators unwilling to let the story die. This was the calm before the storm, the silent years where McNulty's crimes remained unsolved, yet the seeds of eventual justice were quietly being planted. The stage was set for a new chapter, one where cutting-edge science would confront an old, hidden evil: the hunt through genetic genealogy. Have you ever wondered why it took decades to uncover the truth? The answer lies in a groundbreaking field: investigative genetic genealogy, IgG. Unlike standard DNA testing, which only compares a suspect's DNA with national databases like CODIS, IgG takes a completely different approach, leveraging advances in technology and the voluntary sharing of personal genetic data. Imagine DNA as a detailed map of your ancestors. Scientists no longer just compare two maps to see if they match. They search for intersecting pathways. This is how IgG works. After decoding McNulty's DNA from the crime scene, investigators held in their hands a genetic blueprint of the perpetrator. Instead of submitting it to CODIS, where McNulty had no record, they uploaded the data to public genealogy databases, like GEDmatch or Family Tree DNA. These platforms, used by millions worldwide, allow people to trace their family history and reconnect with distant relatives. The first step was unusual, not to find the criminal directly, but to identify his distant relatives. Genealogical experts began by pinpointing individuals whose DNA partially matched the perpetrators. The match could be small, enough to suggest a shared ancestor. Think of a third or fourth cousin, someone you may never meet, yet sharing fragments of DNA passed down from a great-great-grandparent. The Golden State Killer case is a classic example, where investigators worked through an enormous family tree to narrow down the suspect. Once these distant relatives were identified, the genealogists became 21st-century detectives. They built an extensive family tree tracing back to the common ancestor of the matches. From there, they carefully worked down each branch, consulting public records, such as birth certificates, obituaries, marriage licenses, military records, and even old newspaper articles, to find names that fit the profile. They searched for a man living in the areas of the crimes, with the right age, and connections to Ventura, Columbus, and other relevant locations. The deeper they dug, the more the suspect list shrank. Eventually, one name emerged: Sean Patrick McNulty. His profile suspiciously aligned with all the collected data. He had served in the Navy, had ties to the locations of the crimes, and, crucially, had died shortly after being suspected in a sexual assault case. But to reach a definitive conclusion, one final step was necessary: DNA confirmation. Investigators obtained permission from a close relative to provide a sample, and the results were irrefutable. The DNA from the crime scene matched McNulty's exactly. The case was resolved in a way no one had anticipated. With McNulty deceased, the story might have ended there. But for the survivors, this marked the beginning of a new chapter: the voices of the survivors. In every case, numbers, evidence, and names are only part of the story. The most important part belongs to the survivors. For the victims of Sean Patrick McNulty, every day was a silent battle against fear, trauma, and helplessness. They lived with a haunting question: would the person who stole their peace ever be brought to justice? When news broke that the perpetrator had been identified, it was more than a news item. It was a moment of liberation. One survivor in Columbus, Ohio, shared in an emotional news video: "I've lived with that feeling for 40 years. I never thought this case would be solved." These words were not just statements, they were the voice of decades of waiting, despair, and finally, release. She continued, "When I heard the news, a weight was lifted from my shoulders. It was not vengeance, but a recognition that their pain was real and that justice, though delayed, had been served." In Ventura, where the first two assaults occurred, investigators were able to contact one of the victims. Although the attacks had taken place in 1982 and 1983, this survivor had waited over 40 years for answers. The confirmation that her attacker had been identified, even posthumously, brought a sense of peace that words cannot fully capture. It was acknowledgement of her long, silent struggle. Sexual assaults often leave invisible scars, hard to heal. With McNulty having taken his own life to evade justice, his victims faced the cruel reality. The perpetrator would never face punishment, yet the public identification of his name, the scientific confirmation of his crimes, brought another form of justice. It was a balm for their pain, a reassurance that he could not escape completely. His death was not the end of the story, but the beginning of the healing process for those he had harmed. Questions of ethics and law. The case of Sean Patrick McNulty had been solved, but it opened a new, complex chapter for the criminal justice system. With IgG technology becoming increasingly common, a central question arises: can we accept trading privacy for justice? Consider this. Millions of people have uploaded their DNA to public databases, mostly out of curiosity about their ancestry or to find distant relatives. They never imagined that their data and the data of their unrelated family members could be used in a criminal investigation. This is the heart of the ethical debate. Would you allow authorities to use your personal information and that of your relatives to track a criminal you never knew existed? Some legal experts argue that this does not violate the Fourth Amendment of the U.S. Constitution, which protects citizens from unreasonable searches and seizures. Their argument is based on the abandonment doctrine, which asserts that voluntarily sharing information with a third party, like a genealogy company, means you forfeit a reasonable expectation of privacy over that information. In other words, once you put your DNA online, you relinquish control over it. Privacy advocates, however, see it differently. They argue that the terms of service of these companies are not clear enough for users to understand that their DNA could be used in criminal investigations. They also raise concerns about the lack of consent from relatives, who may be implicated in a case simply because they share a distant ancestor. Using investigative genetic genealogy to solve crimes has clear benefits. It has helped resolve hundreds of cold cases and brought peace to victims and their families, quote, said one legal expert. It's the most powerful tool we have this century to tackle cases that once seemed unsolvable. Conversely, a privacy attorney warned, "We are entering uncharted territory." Currently, there is no federal regulation on the use of IgG in criminal investigations. This sets a dangerous precedent, allowing law enforcement access to vast amounts of genetic data without a warrant. Once we open this door, we don't know where it could lead. There is concern that in the future, the technology could be misused to monitor minor offenses, or even to create citizen profiles based on genetic traits. These fears are not unfounded. There have been instances where police attempted to use DNA companies to track suspects for nonviolent crimes. The McNulty case, along with others like it, forces us to confront a challenging question. What risks are we willing to accept in the pursuit of justice? The future of justice and crime. The case of Sean Patrick McNulty is a powerful testament to the capabilities of technology, but it is far from unique. In fact, it is part of a larger wave that began in 2018, when the Golden State Killer case, Joseph James DeAngelo, was solved using IgG, ending a decades-long manhunt of over 40 years. Like McNulty, DeAngelo was a serial rapist and murderer. Both cases relied on DNA samples collected in the 1980s and 1990s, and both were solved using public genealogy databases. The difference: McNulty was deceased, while DeAngelo remained alive to face his sentence. Another notable case is the Bear Brook murders, where 4 members of a family were killed and buried in barrels for decades. IgG helped law enforcement identify both the victims and the perpetrator, providing answers to family members who had waited years for closure. These stories demonstrate that IgG is becoming an indispensable tool in the fight against crime. It allows investigators to solve cases that once seemed impossible. Yet with each success, a new question arises: Are we creating a society where genetic privacy no longer exists? The future of IgG remains uncertain. Lawyers, technology experts, and legislators are debating whether clear legal frameworks should govern its use. Some suggest restricting IgG to only the most serious crimes, while others advocate for an outright ban. Regardless, one thing is certain: this technology has changed the game. Criminals who once escaped into the shadows now face a new reality. Their DNA, even decades buried, can speak. The case of Sean Patrick McNulty is a reminder that no crime is perfect, and justice, no matter how delayed, has a way of finding us, even if we are no longer alive to witness it. If you want to learn more about other chilling cases solved through technology, don't forget to like and share this video. See you in the next one.